Hello, I'm Ashwin Segkar, filling in for Rihanna. Have you heard of the Dark Triad? It sounds quite ominous, doesn't it? It refers to the three quote-unquote dark psychological traits that are in all of us. And those who have them in higher degrees can become some of the most destructive people in our society. Criminals, manipulators, cheaters. These qualities, the Dark Triad, are narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. So why are they grouped together, and what do you need to know about them? Dr. Rachel Hannam is a registered psychologist, and she's here to explain it and help you better manage your own dark traits and that of those in the people in your life. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, Ashwin. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Let's start off with a summary definition. What is the Dark Triad, and what are the elements of these three traits?
Okay, well, this is a relatively new term in psychology. It was a phrase coined by a couple of psychologists in a paper, I think in 2012. As you mentioned, the three dark traits, the Dark Triad, are narcissism, which we know a lot about, psychopathy, which we also know a lot about in psychology, and Machiavellianism, which is not really a term that originates from psychology, more from politics and the business world. But in 2012, these three were brought together. There was a recognition that there was a huge overlap between the three traits.
Take us through each one. What's the definition of narcissism, and what does a person who has those traits, what do they act like?
Well, first of all, one of the aspects that all three in the Dark Triad have in common is very low on empathy. So a disregard for other people's feelings and for other people's needs. That's something that they've all got in common. But of course that can manifest differently, and there are different elements which do make them distinct concepts. So we traditionally think of narcissists as being very self-interested. Well, all three traits are very self-interested, but people who have a sense of entitlement, who feel like they're very special, better than others, above others, and deserve more or deserve special treatment. They can be, although they're not always, quite grandiose, and they're probably the easiest to spot, the narcissists, because they will tell you that they're better than others in one way or another. There's quite overt about it most of the time. The Machiavellian folk, on the other hand, don't necessarily want to be in the spotlight like the narcissists. They are more manipulative. They're the kind of people who'll say one thing to your face and something very different behind your back. They are very cunning and ruthless types who strategize and will be deceitful, as can the narcissists, to get what they want. They'll do whatever it takes. And then the psychopaths may not be as able to forward plan. They might have not as good impulse control as the Machiavellian folk, although they can also be quite charming. They have a real disregard and a really low ability for empathy, and these are the ones you tend to find in jail.
Do we know if these traits are based on nature or nurture?
That's a really good question. It's always a combination of being born with some genetic predisposition or temperamental tendency that you inherit towards certain defense mechanisms, certain ways of handling stress or trauma in your life. Some people get addiction, some people get depression, some people end up with panic, but some people end up with these sorts of traits as a way of coping with environmental influences, but their coping strategies will be influenced by their genetics. They say that the psychopaths probably have the most influence from genetics, that their brain the genetics may be such that their brain develops lacking the connections that cause empathy, lacking in some way in the parts of their brain which would enable empathy. Whereas they say that the narcissists and the Machiavellian types probably have more influence from nurture.
Even though we say it's lacking, there must be an evolutionary reason why these traits have emerged. Do they serve a good purpose?
Absolutely. I mean, an example or a vignette used in the research is, a mother's walking down the road with her baby and somebody snatches the baby out of her arms. and she runs after the person who snatched her baby. And in that moment, she will do anything to get the baby back, right? She will punch the guy in the face. She'll whack him over the head with a baseball bat, or her, whoever it is that's nicked the baby, and with total disregard for the for the feelings of the person who's snatched her baby, who may not be hurting the baby. And you can see the survival value in that. So, it helps when we need to be in survival mode and when we need to be competitive and we need to be aggressive. It just doesn't help when we need to collaborate and cooperate.
And I guess as our world changes from surviving saber-toothed tigers to working together, the psychopaths are kind of out of a job in some ways.
The psychopaths are often out of a job, and that is a very common characteristic, that psychopaths tend to have high levels of unemployment and move from place to place to place. However, the narcissists and the Machiavellian folk are more likely to succeed in business.
Why is that?
Well, I'm not sure exactly. This is actually not a field that I'm an expert in, and if there's any personality psychologists listening in, maybe they can call up and answer. But I think it's impulse control is one variable. I think psychopaths, have strong impulses that they find difficult to control, whereas the Machiavellian folk, they can plan, they can strategize, they can say one thing to your face, something else behind your back. And the narcissists, they're quite good at winning people over, quite good at being charming and, getting people to look up to them.
What is grandiose narcissism, and how does that differ from vulnerable narcissism?
So my understanding is that the grandiose narcissists are what we typically think of as narcissists. So Donald Trump comes to my mind. I've got all the best ideas, I've got all the best words, somebody who is typically quite showy, happy to tell you how good they are, grandiose, arrogant, likes attention, likes the spotlight, very self-focused. The original story of Narcissus.
Yes, looking in his lake's reflection in his lake.
Yeah, he was this. Do you know the Greek mythology behind it? That he was the most beautiful boy, and the prophet came and said to the parents, "Don't let him look in a mirror. Whatever you do, don't let him look in any shiny brass things, or don't let him see himself. It'll destroy his world and everybody's around him." But when he did, and he saw himself in the lake, he was he'd already screwed over some nymph who was in love with him, so she turned him into a flower.
Yes. And he fell in love with himself.
And he had to stay in love with himself and be lonely and isolated in that for his life.
When people act like that, sometimes others will say, they're compensating for low self-esteem. So are you saying grandiose narcissists don't have low self-esteem, but perhaps vulnerable ones do?
Yeah, well, this is a interesting question, and there's a lot of debate. But a lot of people seem to think that deep down they lack true self-love and true self-worth. So it is a compensation. So it comes out in the converse way as, overly high self-esteem without any ability to self-reflect or take criticism. That's another thing. Narcissists can't take criticism.
So we're going to talk to you about looking for signs of someone being a narcissist. So one example is that they'll react quite strongly to criticism. Can you tell us a bit about that and any other signs that we can look out for?
Yeah, well, that hypersensitivity to criticism and the sort of all or nothing thinking that you can see in narcissists is probably related to lack of deep self-worth and sort of intolerable shame. So, yeah, you do get things like hypersensitivity to criticism, to rejection, quite aggressive reactions and manipulative behaviours, putting pressure on people to make a decision now. Emotional manipulation, wanting people that they're dealing with to feel confused, guilty or anxious so they can, get what they want.
Is there anything in our parenting styles that can raise a narcissistic child?
Yeah, well, they do say that people are getting more narcissistic and that it's the culture and that parenting has changed. So if one of the key traits of narcissism is low empathy, then, and that's only one of the traits, but we can explicitly teach children empathy. I do get asked sometimes, do you think that social media is making us more narcissistic? All the selfies, right? All the focus on all the individualism. And that's only one part of narcissism, is that self-interest and self-focus. Because a person who puts beautiful pictures of themselves on Instagram may also be able to go and give empathy to others and take their perspective. And, so we've got to be careful. I think we overuse it. But that lack of empathy is pretty key. So I think in our parenting we can teach that.
What are some ways to develop empathy?
In children?
Yes. In
children, I think it's quite simple because they need it to be easy and clear. So it's things like, for a very young child, that child is crying. You hit him with the Lego and it hurt him. Can you see that? Do you know? How would you feel? It's perspective taking. How would you feel if that was you? And I've had to do that with my own children many, many times, especially when they were younger. What would that be like if it was you? How do you think you'd feel? So getting them to put themselves in the other one's shoes and teaching them an emotional literacy, giving them the words so that they can put feelings into words, helping them express their needs by giving them the vocabulary to do that, and teaching them how to ask others about what they're feeling and what they're needing. Modelling that. You can't teach your children more empathy than what you've got. So developing it as a parent in yourself as well.
Set a good example. We just had a couple of... we had a fiction section, really, with some bloggers and reviewers. Is fiction and reading a good way to develop empathy because you are transported into another character's life?
Yeah, for sure. I think that one piece of research that I read was on creativity. So it sort of relates to your question. But narcissists will report that they're above average in levels of creativity. And when they give them creative tasks, some of which involve bringing, random objects together, some of which involve understanding the motivations of others, they're really bad at it. They think they're really good at it, but they're not. So definitely, I think creative tasks, things that use the imagination, and especially when you have to put yourself in the shoes of another, definitely help.
Do you think one of the good things about creativity, you've tried stand-up, I've seen you doing it, is that you get humbled, and so it's hard to feel better than people when you don't. Is it the humbling aspect of the arts that makes you realise you're actually worse than people or just the same?
Or, just as messy. For sure. I mean, although you get narcissists in every industry, in every sector. I'm sure there are narcissistic comics and actors, but maybe they're less likely to be there. I don't know.
How do you deal with someone who has narcissistic traits?
Yeah. There's lots of good articles online for people who really are up against this at the moment. A couple of things. You need really good boundaries with a narcissist. Same with someone who's more the Machiavellian type and cunning and ruthless. You need really good boundaries because they are pretty good at manipulating you. They'll say things to put pressure on, leave you confused, twist your words, guilt trip you, leave you feeling scared. And that's a good time for them to pounce and put pressure on you. So you need to be clear. An example might be in a workplace where a boss puts pressure on you to do something now or make a decision. And a boundary might sound like, I need time to think about that. Let me get back to you in an hour or a day. So being really clear on your boundaries is really important. Another important thing about dealing with a narcissist is don't try and change them. I see this a lot in my work where I'll have a woman, it's often a woman, not always, but often, come to me and I can see she really, she's got good intentions, I suppose. She wants her husband, who's quite narcissistic, to change his ways, and she's spent years and lots of energy trying to change him or fix him. I've never seen it happen.
Yes.
It's a really not a good use of one's energy. So don't try and fix or change them. If a narcissist is going to change, they will have to probably hit rock bottom and figure out for themselves that they need some help.
Even still, you said it's partly genetic. There's only so much a person can do with that genetic component, isn't there?
They'd have to be pretty motivated. Narcissists tend to only come into therapy for other things, maybe depression or addiction or marriage counselling, which is always interesting.
Machiavellianism is the second element in the Dark Triad, and Rachel, you were saying that it's the low empathy and also using other people as a means to an end. Is that correct, or is there anything else you want to add to this definition of Machiavellianism?
Yeah, that's it. And I don't know as much about it because it's not a concept that comes out of psychology, and it's not in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, unlike the other two which are sort of in there. But it is a term that's been used a lot in the last couple of decades, particularly with regards to politics and business. So it is people who will seek to obtain power at the expense of others. They'll do whatever it takes to get what they want. They don't necessarily want fame, unlike the narcissists who like the spotlight. But they do want power, and they will do whatever it takes. So it's a sort of a lack of morality, lack of ethics.
Narcissists, you said we could spot in a few different ways. One of them was that they're hypersensitive to criticism. Is there a trait that stands out that makes it easier to spot someone with Machiavellian tendencies?
They can be hard to spot in the workplace, and I've had a few clients come to me and they've figured out after a year or two that their boss is very Machiavellian, but because their boss says one thing to their face and something else behind their back, they don't always know, but until it comes back around, or they see them treating other people badly. But it can be tricky to spot these Machiavellian types. Sometimes they just might not be very nice people, and they might treat their underlings quite badly and sort of suck up to the people with more power than them. And if you can spot that, then you might be dealing with one.
How seriously is it taken then by the psychological community if it was imported from political science?
Well, you know, the DSM in itself is a highly political publication that gets debated before every new edition, and ideas that probably should have gone in there get chucked out because of politics. So, you know, if different people had been on the panel, it might be in there. I don't know. But I guess some people would say, look, it is covered. That sort of behaviour is covered to some extent in antisocial personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorders. Although what most people experience in their everyday lives, because people with full-blown personality disorders are fairly rare. So we talk about subclinical levels. So, you know, people who wouldn't meet the full, you know, all the diagnostic criteria, but still display, as you've said, some of these traits. And, you know, some of the same rules that I mentioned before apply with the Machiavellian folk about knowing your boundaries, knowing what you want, don't try and fix them.
Can we see some of these traits in ourselves? And if so, what do we do if we find a bit of Machiavellianism in there?
Sure. Well, you and I both filled out that SD3 earlier on, and we didn't score 0, did we?
No. It's in all of us, isn't it? All of these traits are in all of us, which is one of the points to get across.
I noticed I got a bit higher on narcissism than you,
Oh,
Ashwin.
did you?
Yeah, just a little.
Because you got a PhD, probably. You're going to feel better.
I look better in makeup, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So we all do, you know, and the thing is this. Children would score, you know, high on narcissism and Machiavellianism, and children are a little bit psychopathic, right? Because it's developmentally appropriate for children to, when they're very young, to not really understand the feelings and needs of others, to be very egocentric and narcissistic. You know, they want all the attention. And it's as they get older that they develop empathy and perspective. Teenagers can be also very kind of narcissistic and self-focused. But as their brain develops, they develop or should develop the capacity to understand cooperation and empathy and those kinds of behaviours. And yeah, some people don't, and it might not be their fault. Well, it isn't really ever their fault because maybe their brain isn't particularly set up that way, and maybe they've had a lot of trauma or a certain kind of parenting style that brought that out in them.
In our Western culture, we have books that say, thou shalt be like this and thou shalt be like that. But say the Buddhists, they have loving kindness meditation where you're supposed to visualize someone you don't like and practice, you know, feeling good towards them, like techniques to actually cultivate empathy rather than just saying thou shalt not be unempathetic. Do you think we need to embrace some of these methods for cultivating empathy in our culture?
I so do. I really, really do. And I actually have a loving kindness meditation, a couple actually on my playlist that I send to people because there's science behind it now. We know that we can. Neuroplasticity is a beautiful thing, and we know that we can change our brains through practices such as that, sending kindness and compassion towards those we find difficult to naturally love. I think there's quite a bit in Eastern philosophies that help us to cultivate these transcendent qualities that do transcend the more primal instincts, which I really think are at the heart of the Dark Triad.
So do you think those are things that children should be doing from a young age, just as a counter to the Dark Triad, just getting involved in these types of meditation or mindfulness, or maybe a program that a neuroscientist helps develop?
And there are some schools that are doing this. A friend of mine's a principal of a school on the north side, and she's brought in neuroscience, she's brought in mindfulness. They teach empathy skills. It's fabulous. It's happening.
You're listening to Dr. Rachel Hannam. We are exploring the Dark Triad of psychological traits and how to spot it in others and in yourself. So we've all got some element of these traits. And what do you do if someone in your life has them? Can you explain some of the ways that people with these traits will commonly try to manipulate them, the people around them?
Well, a little bit like what I said before, I think is a common one where they might take your words and twist them. You know, they might ask you to help, and then you say, look, I can't today. And they say, you said to me last week that you like helping people. You know, so they'll sort of a bit of gaslighting, actually. A lot of listeners might have heard this term by now because it seems to be all over the internet. Gaslighting, which is making somebody doubt themselves. From the old, do you know the movie that it's from?
Yeah, where the husband was turning the light down very gradually in the house.
Yeah.
And telling his wife that nothing was happening, and she thought she was going crazy.
She thought she was going crazy. I haven't seen the movie. I thought it was that the gas, he'd turn the gas, up or down. She could smell gas. He's saying you're crazy. Anyway, telling somebody that they're crazy, or in some way making them doubt their own senses, their own thinking, and that destabilizes a person. Pretty much emotional manipulation requires that the other person leaves you feeling anxious, doubtful, confused, or guilty, and in that vulnerable state, they can put pressure on you to do what they want you to do.
It's one of the tactics then to cultivate quite a good awareness of your own feelings, because sometimes it's a very sixth sense that someone just makes you feel grubby or like you're always one-upping someone. There's something about your relationship with a person that it just doesn't feel good to hang out with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And in my training, one of the things one of my mentors said to me is always, as a therapist, always use your feelings as data. How a client makes you feel, use that, because that could well be how that person makes other people feel. Yeah.
Can we just do a side detour into feelings as well? Because I was born in India, which is the whole approach of Indian culture was to transcend feelings and meditate and just leave your psychological obsessions behind.
Yes.
But in the Western culture, we talk a lot about our feelings. We introspect a lot and confess a lot what we're feeling. What's the balance to be struck between reflecting on your feelings and being aware of them and letting them go?
I want to say it in a slightly different way, and I want to refer to an Indian teacher, Osho, who you may have heard of. Have you heard of Osho? Yeah. And he says in one of his books, the baby and the enlightened person in some ways are the same. They don't have a self. They don't have an ego anymore. But the difference is the baby has never left home and the enlightened person has returned home, but has returned home by going full circle through the development of their sense of self and their ego. I think there's a Taoist saying that says, observe yourself, know yourself, forget yourself. So I think there is there is something to be said for self-awareness, observing yourself, feeling your feelings, observing them, being able to name them, being able to talk about them. And in the process of that growing self-awareness, then I think you can let it go. That's my belief. Strike
a balance. And it sounds like you're doing that already. You're doing love and kindness meditations and you're, using classical psychology training as well.
Yeah. Yes.
They work together. You are listening to Dr. Rachel Hannam. We're going to play another song and then let's talk about psychopathy, which is probably the most harmful of the traits, isn't it, out of the three?
Yes. When I was just looking up, as I said before, it's not as common a phrase in psychology. It comes from politics and business. But I was reading about poor old Machiavelli, who eventually got exiled in his early 50s to the countryside. They kicked him out of the city in Italy. There was a lot of tumult at that time, but he also didn't seem to care about other people very much, and pretty immoral sort of guy. And so he's known for that. But then it said he wrote a letter to, when he was in exile in the country, he wrote a letter to his friend Francesco Vittori, and he said, "When evening comes, I go home to my study, and on the threshold I take off my work clothes covered in mud, and I put on the clothes an ambassador would wear. Decently dressed, I enter the ancient courts of rulers who have long since died. There I am warmly welcomed, and I feed on the only food I find nourishing and was born to savour. I am not ashamed to talk to them and ask them to explain their actions, and they, out of kindness, answer me. 4 hours go by without my feeling any anxiety. I forget every worry, and I am no longer afraid of poverty or death. I live entirely through them being the dead rulers." And he wrote this in a letter to his friend.
Yes.
So not only was he Machiavellian, Machiavelli, he was delusional.
Yeah, he had obviously a very good supply of mushrooms at the time.
Yeah, so I just thought that was really amusing that he,
And this is someone who's been quite influential in our culture,
Right.
the ideas of this person.
Well, yes, and some people lament that there's still a fair bit of Machiavellianism in politics, and that there's narcissists running big companies, and that this trait is going to take over the world. But I'm not so worried about that, because I still believe out of competition and cooperation, it's cooperation in the end that leads to success in business and in life.
It's just a lesson that we have to learn the hard way. With enough damage done, we'll probably learn the importance of cooperation over being out for yourself.
Yeah, and some people do. I've worked with people who have strong narcissistic traits who really want to work on it. Not many, but it happens.
What do you do for them?
Well, they need to, for some of them, particularly if they've got a bit more of this psychopathic stuff, which I think we're about to talk about, they have it's almost like a bit of a social emotional learning disorder. They have a lot more trouble innately understanding the social and emotional rules of human relationships. So sometimes they need to, and this is where you sometimes see, I just want to add a little bit of an overlap in adults, not so much in children, I don't think, but in adults, between things like Asperger's and narcissism. And it's quite a big question. There's lots of articles. Is my husband a narcissist, or does he just have Asperger's? Because in both conditions, there's a difficulty understanding the feelings and of others and the social norms, the unwritten social rules. So, but people can learn that stuff if it doesn't come naturally to them. Just like I can learn how to do my taxes, even though that doesn't come naturally to me at all. You can teach them the language of emotions and of needs, and you can do exercises which are about perspective taking, and it does help.
One thing that came out with Greta Thunberg recently was that Asperger's can actually be a strength in some ways, is that you don't care what people think of you, so you take actions that the herd won't. Exactly.
Look, everything is context. What can be a liability in one context can be a real strength in another. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's understanding the complexity of the Dark Triad, which is what we're doing with Dr. Rachel Hannam. We talked about narcissism. And just before we get to psychopathy, it's such an interesting thing about psychology. You've taken this word from Greek mythology, Narcissus' story of looking himself in the mirror. You talked about gaslighting earlier, which is from a movie.
Yes.
Psychology is not scared of drawing from all these other disciplines, as long as they happen to be reflecting on the human condition.
Yeah, absolutely. And the term narcissism was in use a little bit, but really only the term narcissistic personality disorder didn't make it into the DSM till 1981. So it's quite recent that we've decided this is a bit pathological. This could interfere with the lives of the people with it or those around them. So it's now in the DSM. But yeah, absolutely. I think psychology has no choice but to draw on imagery and metaphor and story, because we're talking about our inner world and our inner life. We can't see that. At one level, it's chemical and electrical, but when we want to start talking about it, we need to draw on the world around us to be able to give it meaning.
Tell me what we should know about psychopaths.
Okay. Well, like I mentioned before, psychopaths out of this dark triad are probably the ones with the greatest extent of a kind of social emotional learning disorder. The research suggests that the linkages between the primal part of the brain, the amygdala and limbic system, and the prefrontal cortex, those linkages just are not happening the way they should be. So they kind of just don't get it. That coupled with impulse control problems means that you see more criminality. This is out of the three, this is the one with the most amount of criminality. So, these are the ones who have, actually all of them can have pretty unstable relationships, but these ones tend to be more aggressive, tend to be more violent, and more likely to end up in jail, as I said. Also have lower levels of anxiety. Apparently they don't startle as easily. So, this is where you get the antisocial behaviours and at the extreme end, the violent criminals. It's the other two, I think, the Machiavellian folk, the narcissistic folk, they're more likely to sort of understand the social rules, but they just don't care. These guys just don't seem to get it, and they seem to have very shallow emotional response to things. They don't seem to feel things as much.
Do they get any leeway from the justice system because of this tendency that they're born with?
I'm not sure about that, not being a lawyer. I think our justice system, my limited understanding is that there is a bit more of what we call restorative justice, which is one of the aims of which is to help criminals, perpetrators, understand the effect on others of what they've done, the impact on their victims. And so I think whenever that process is happening, it's because we do understand that they don't really understand, they don't get it. It's tricky though, because we do still need to keep these people away from others if they have a tendency towards violence and aggression.
But it's interesting how ideas about criminal justice will have to be updated when some people have these natural tendencies, even though they need to be kept away for deterrent effect. You almost feel sorry for them that they just don't function. They don't have the empathy that we'd want them to.
Oh, I do feel sorry for them. I feel a great deal of compassion for them. It doesn't mean that I want them walking the streets.
No.
I think, and it's complex. I think it would be dangerous for judges to go, well, it's not his fault. We can easily take our understanding of neuroscience and genetics and use it to abdicate responsibility. I still think we need a system that encourages full responsibility.
So how do we do that? So you encounter a psychopath in your clinic, even at a young age. What do you do to help them overcome this psychopathy?
Look, I've only had one or two people over the years that I would say are a full-blown psychopath, very, very antisocial. They don't come very many times. That's the thing. You can't usually work with them because even if they show up, they don't want to do the hard work. They don't want to take responsibility, so they often don't keep coming unless they're required to. I've had, I remember this, shouldn't laugh, should I? This is the dark humour of psychologists laughing at terrible things. But he told me this story, it was a couple, and the husband told me a story about hitting a cyclist in his car, and the cyclist fell off quite badly and was quite hurt. And then the man said to me, he got out and he felt so annoyed. And I thought, annoyed? Oh, he felt so guilty or so worried. He was going to be late for his next appointment.
Right.
He just ran over a cyclist. And so I thought, that's a little bit psychopathic.
Yes. What do you do? That's for life, that mentality, isn't it?
Well, I delve a bit deeper into, what were all the feelings going on for them and at the time and then later on that day and now as they recount the story, just to see if there is some sort of, fear, regret, remorse, some sort of bad feeling. There wasn't with this fellow. I think I only saw him once or twice. But I have had people who are, not so high on the continuum and do know they need to change. And like I said, it is a process of getting them to be able to name emotion, understand the function of it, notice it in other people, and a lot of work to here and now with emotional intelligence work, but also going back and seeing where it comes from, because it almost always comes from childhood trauma.
What are the ways to address that then? Do they have to spend a lot of time uncovering and unpacking that childhood trauma, or they use more cognitive behavioural therapies. How intensive does the treatment have to be for psychopathy?
One of the other things that I wanted to say on this topic is that it wasn't until about the 70s that I think it was Karen Horney, quite a famous psychologist, pointed out that things like narcissism and psychopathy were probably a defense mechanism, she said. This is the first person who'd ever said it, a defense mechanism against shame and vulnerability and trauma from earlier times. And that, maybe these people needed to learn to tolerate emotion because it had become so shut down in them. So it's a slow process, building people's capacity for vulnerability, to feel bad, to feel scared, to feel sadness, to feel anything that makes a person feel vulnerable, and to help them sit in that and know that that's not shameful, know that that's quite normal, know that it actually in the end will help them connect with other people. That's something that most of these people have not learned growing up.
That's something sounds quite complex, and you would do with a therapist.
Over time. Yeah.
What if you're, say, at the more moderate end of the scale and you're feeling, oh, look, I don't care enough about the damage that I cause. I should care more. There's something going on. I'm not being completely honest and real. Is there something you can do in your own life to overcome that feeling that you're desensitized?
Well, the internet's great for lots of things, right? So, I mean, you and I looked at some tests if people are out there wondering, do I have some of these traits? Could I be a narcissist? Do I have personality disorder? Google it, because there are free tests you can take just to give yourself reassurance that you're not. But yeah, if you think, I've got a few of those, but not all of them. My experience with nonviolent communication has been life-changing, and there are some good courses around Brisbane and in every capital city. And there's also some good online courses, and it's got a strange name, nonviolent communication, but it's also known as compassionate communication, which is really a communication tool in disguise. It's really a self-awareness tool for understanding feelings and needs. It's not the only tool or body of work that is focused on how do we understand our feelings, make sense of them, articulate our needs to ourselves and others. There are a lot of online courses that people can do. And, I liked your suggestion before of delving into novels which focus on relationships and motivations and emotions of characters. The arts is a really good way, And if people are only moderate on the scale, then, getting out there and doing those kinds of things will probably develop them and help them in that way. I think if people are very emotionally shut down and have a real block, even that might not help them, and that's where they might need to get professional help.
What aspect of the arts is it that is helping them? The expression or the activity? Tell me about how the arts helps, and which arts would be better for someone.
This is like a whole other hour, isn't it?
Yes.
Well, I've seen you do lots of comedy. You've seen me try, and it's very vulnerable. It's a vulnerability-inducing thing, even for the audience, because we're sitting there watching, knowing that some things might be said that might shake us up a bit, which is the whole point of much of the arts world, is to kind of open us up and let us into an aspect of life, which is often quite a vulnerable thing to do. So I think the arts definitely, whether it's music, whether it's comedy, whether it's cinema or fiction, can definitely draw on our feelings. And if we can be with our feelings, I think that's the key, and maybe the answer to your question is when feelings come up, if we can sit with them, breathe into them, notice them without reacting to them, without trying to shut them down, then we do slowly build our tolerance and our capacity to feel.
What are some of the myths about psychopathy that you'd like to bust?
Some of the myths about psychopathy that I'd like to bust. Well, that you can pick them straight away. I think that's not always true. I think they can be quite difficult to spot.
Are they generally more intelligent?
I believe so. I believe in some ways they can be very, very intelligent. Their emotional intelligence is low. And as I said before, there's some research to suggest that their creativity is not very high either. But I think they can be very smart in certain ways, academically. they might be very good at technology or maths or business in certain ways that can get them ahead. So you can't always spot them. And I think the other myth is that, and this is true of all of the Dark Triad traits, is that, these people should be punished. That will not help. That will make it worse. They're still human beings who, have the rights. I'm very Kantian, not Machiavellian, so I think they have the rights of anybody that anybody has. So the right to be challenged, to take responsibility for themselves, if you can do that. It's not always easy. And the right to respect, the right to be held up as human beings who, do have feelings somewhere in there. So they're not robots, they're still people.
When I was researching for this, it was saying the main trait that psychopathy correlates with is agreeableness. It correlates negatively with agreeableness. So if you have a friend in your life who just is happy to say things to your face that they wouldn't say anywhere else, or, just to have that bluntness and directness, is that a marker to look out for?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned agreeableness, because the big five have been a major way of explaining the Dark Triad. All three of them are low on agreeableness. Being extremely high on agreeableness is also not good, because you can become a doormat and a people pleaser. But they tend to be very low on agreeableness. So, I think that's to do with empathy and ability to relate to others. They won't easily be influenced by others. They have very strong ideas about what they want to do, and they're going to do it. And so, if you have that friend who's like that, who tends to be difficult to get along with, please don't go out there diagnosing all of your friends after this interview. It's not that straightforward.
Just send them the online link to the test and then diagnose them.
Yes, the SD3. Yes. Look, we all have traits, as you said, and we can all have our bad moments and our bad periods in life. But I think the key things are consistency and persistence. If this goes on and on across various situations over time, and it's fairly consistent, then you've got a pattern, and you need patterns in order to kind of diagnose anything.
We're going to talk about the light triad in a moment, but before we leave the dark world, is there anything you'd like to tell the listener to know about this world as they go out into their work and life tomorrow?
Oh, look, there's so many. It's such a great topic. We could probably talk about it for hours. But I think just from my clinical work, I don't see a lot of people who present as clients with this stuff, but I do see a lot of people who've been affected by them. And sometimes it's someone you care about a great deal, a co-worker, a boss, or a partner. And I just sit there and listen to these poor people who've been so hurt, and they're still trying to convince this narcissist or this psychopath, of the error of their ways. And I just want to say, it doesn't work. You can't change them.
You can't change them, but can you adapt your life so you only see your partner once a week or twice a week? Is that the only solution? You have to just cut them down in your life.
Well, sometimes they can talk big and promise a lot, so don't reward that. I think you have to be very pragmatic with them. I think that you reward the behaviour when they do something pro-social, when they do what they say they're going to do, and it's in some way cooperative or pro-social, reward that.
So that kind of conditioning works?
Well, yeah, it works on all of us, I think, to a point. We're all human in that way. And so I would say be quite pragmatic, be very clear on your boundaries, accept them as they are, because your efforts to change them will only drive them further into their pathology. But sometimes invoke the crowd, because sometimes when they're outnumbered, that's a tricky one.
That's one of the lessons of stand-up comedy. Get the crowd to turn on the heckler.
Right.
And they shut up.
Yeah, see? There you go. So it can work, but surely even in comedy you have to be very discerning about that one.
Yeah, otherwise the crowd turns on you.
Yeah, that's right. So you do need to be careful with that one.
Tell me about the light triad. Yeah,
so with the advent of, or the burgeoning of positive psychology in the last 20 years, thanks, Martin Seligman. It's positive psychologists sort of say, look, why do we just focus on, all the difficult pathological stuff? What about the stuff that makes life good? And so not long after the Dark Triad was proposed, the Light Triad was proposed, what predicts saints.
We've only got 45 seconds. Can you tell us the key elements of the Light Triad?
Yes, the Light Triad is Kantianism, and Kant was another philosopher who said that humans are worthy just because they are, just because they're born. Faith in humanity, thinking that people are generally good at the end of the day. And the last one is honesty and humility.
I needed that shower of good morals after what we've talked about.
Yes.
Dr. Rachel Hannam, thank you for coming in today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.